Tonight, you enter a city that called itself civilized while breathing through soot, sewage, rose water, and habit. The lamps are already lit. Their amber halos tremble in the damp, and every stone ahead of you carries the polished confidence of an empire that believed it was moving forward, even while its streets squelched beneath silk hems and boot leather. Victorian England liked to imagine itself clean in the moral sense, proper in the social sense, and modern in the mechanical sense. But under the gaslight, and under the collars, and under the carpets, another reality waited patiently for anyone willing to walk slowly enough to notice it. So come a little closer, but not too close. There is no need to rush into the worst of anything tonight. We are not here to be shocked awake. We are only here to drift through a long, dark city and let it reveal itself a little at a time. The night can hold it better than the day can. The shadows are kind. The corners are softer. Even the foulest truths feel less sharp after midnight. You are only listening. You are only passing by. The air belongs to the story, not to your lungs. Ahead of you stretches a London street lined with brick faces and curtained windows. A bakery has long since closed, though a memory of warmth still lingers near its door. A church bell has just finished tolling, somewhere farther off. Wheels groan against stone, and somewhere above your head a sash window lifts an inch and then settles again. The fog is not quite fog. It is smoke and damp and river breath tangled together until they become a weather of their own. It tastes faintly metallic, like rainwater left in an iron cup. The first surprise of Victorian hygiene is not that it was horrible, though it often was. The first surprise is that it could coexist so comfortably with beauty. Lace curtains can glow in dirty windows. Polished brass can shine above a gutter carrying kitchen slops. A gentleman can tip his hat with great dignity, while his boots drag half a street of manure across a threshold. Refinement and filth are not opposites here. They are roommates. You walk a little farther, and the street begins to teach your body how the century feels. The pavement is slick, not with one thing, but with everything at once. Mud, ash, horse dung, stale rain, soot from yesterday's fires, fish scales from market stalls, wilted cabbage leaves, and gray water tipped from bowls and buckets all seem to have signed some quiet agreement to meet under your feet. Even in the dark, you can sense the layers. Your boot lifts with a soft, tacky reluctance from the cobbles. A carriage wheel passes and sends a fan of cold grit outward. A dog trots by, pauses at the edge of the gutter, then decides against whatever it had first noticed. This would have been ordinary. That is the detail that matters most. Not the disgust, though the disgust was real, not the smell. Though the smell was unforgettable, the real key is the ordinary. The street was not a scandal to the people forced to use it every day. It was simply the street, the place you crossed to work, to church, to school, to market, to the river, to the bathhouse if you were lucky, and back home again in shoes that could never quite be made innocent by the doormat. If these slow night walks ever become part of your own routine, you might let the channel stay close by for the next one. But there is no hurry even for that. Tonight belongs to the lamps, the stones, and the low, patient voice of a city that thought itself upright while quietly drowning in its own habits. A woman in a wool shawl moves past you with the tired confidence of someone who has memorized every trustworthy patch of road. A butcher's boy follows with a pail swinging from one hand. Two pigs nose at the edge of a heap beside a public house wall, as if they had been appointed assistant sweepers for the parish. In poorer districts they almost had. A crossing sweeper, thin as a rake and serious as a magistrate, drags his broom through the muck and creates not cleanliness, but a temporary arrangement. The filth shifts, that is all. It is persuaded into one shape so that traffic may invent another. You might imagine sweepers as part of a system, but so much of Victorian sanitation before reform was really a series of negotiations. Sweep this into the gutter, throw that into the river, tip this behind the yard wall, cover that with ash, air the sheets, dust the rug, open the window, shut the window, scatter herbs, burn a little something pleasant, carry a scented cloth, walk faster, pretend not to notice. There were rules, of course, and boards and inspectors and pamphlets and arguments. But everyday hygiene often came down to the local customs of concealment. Appearance mattered deeply. A doorstep could be scrubbed until it looked almost proud, while the lane beyond it stank with stable runoff and human convenience. A man might keep his collar immaculate, though the shirt beneath it had not been washed for far too long. A woman might beat soot from a skirt and hang sachets among her linens, because society judged visible negligence more harshly than invisible contamination. To look orderly was to claim respectability. To be sanitary in the modern sense was often impossible. Listen now to the city itself, a clatter of crockery from a basement kitchen, the brief, sharp cry of a baby from somewhere above, hooves ringing on stone, then dulling as the horse turns into softer muck. Someone coughs behind a door. Someone laughs. A bucket is emptied. A scrap seller calls out to no one in particular. Human life here is not abstract. It is crowded, layered, tired, improvising. That is why it is worth meeting gently. The smell changes from corner to corner, near the market. Old vegetables and fish, near the stables. A warm, grassy heaviness already turning sour. Near the river, a slower, darker odor, less sharp but more inescapable. Outside a tannery, something bitter and chemical. Outside a bakery, sweet relief for 3 seconds at most before the wind remembers its duties. There are districts whose names alone could make Londoners wrinkle their noses, and others where wealth did not eliminate smell but merely taught it better manners. And still, the longer you walk, the more the extraordinary threatens to become background. This is one of the city's most dangerous talents. It trains the senses into surrender. What you first register as an offense becomes, by repetition, weather. Your brain stops protesting, not because conditions improve, but because resistance is expensive. That is how people endure. That is also how they miss the scale of what surrounds them. You pass a row of houses with fan lights over the doors and polished knockers gleaming even in the haze. Behind those doors are parlors with upholstery holding years of coal smoke, hallways crossed by shoes carrying street matter inward. Bedrooms with chamber pots tucked under bedsteads, washstands with chipped basins, and people who would have considered themselves perfectly decent. They were not wrong. Decency and hygiene were never identical things in Victorian England. They often marched in parallel while refusing to touch. You do not have to go inside yet. Let the thought of those rooms remain behind their curtains for a little longer. Stay in the safer wideness of the street. The lamps make islands on the road. The church tower vanishes into the smoke above. A cat runs along a wall and disappears. Somewhere a watchman's staff strikes stone. You are only listening. You are only passing through. The city can remain at a distance until it is ready to open one of its windows and let the next layer fall. When the window opens, it does not do so dramatically. There is no thunder, no operatic music, just the scrape of wood, the cough of a sleeper turned half awake, and then the private fact of the body becoming public. Chamber pots were among the most intimate objects in the Victorian household and among the least romantic. They waited under beds, beside night tables, behind folding screens, near nursery cots, in attics, in servants' rooms, in lodging houses, in better bedrooms with better wallpaper, and in cramped rooms where 5 or 6 people slept shoulder to shoulder and prayed no one else needed the pot at the same time. There is something almost comically blunt about them. Empire, industry, etiquette, literature, theology, and steam engines all coexisted with the plain ceramic pot under the bed. You could spend the evening discussing reform, virtue, railway investment, missionary work, or Italian opera, and then before sleep trust your most private needs to a vessel no more grand than a glazed bowl with a handle. Civilization is often less a ladder than a stack of contradictory objects in the same room. By morning, those objects demanded attention. In houses with yards or servants or somewhat better systems, the contents could be emptied into privies, cesspits, or drains. In poorer and denser districts, disposal became more improvisational. Window emptying was real enough to shape behavior. People learned to listen as they walked. They learned which lanes were safer, at which hour. They learned that a cry from above was not conversation, but warning. The sky in a crowded city was not always innocent. If your imagination flinches at that, let it do so only lightly. We are not standing beneath the splash zone. We are only tracing the logic of daily life in a city where private sanitation had not yet been fully invented for the masses. Shared privies served courtyards and alleys. A row of homes might depend on one wooden structure built over a pit that filled too quickly and breathed too freely. In wet weather, the floor went slick. In hot weather, the odor grew muscular. At night, the trip there might require a lantern, a shawl, courage, and excellent balance. Think of an old woman in a boarding house hesitating at the corridor door in the middle of winter. Think of a child too frightened by the dark yard to go outside alone. Think of a servant carrying a sloshing pot down 2 flights of stairs before the house wakes. These are not dramatic gestures. They are the small repeated labors upon which the illusion of domestic order rested. The prosperous began to install water closets sooner, but even there progress was less tidy than memory suggests. Flush toilets could impress guests, flatter household pride, and reduce certain indignities upstairs. Yet the city beneath was not prepared for them. Pipes lacked proper traps. Ventilation failed. Sewer gases drifted back. Water supply fluctuated. Waste moved away from the sitting room and into a larger system of neglect. On the scale of one house, innovation. On the scale of the whole city, acceleration. Many Victorians believed foul smells caused disease. Bad air seemed like a reasonable enemy because it announced itself so aggressively. If a water closet stank, then surely danger lived in the stench. Miasma theory fit the nose. It also fit a culture that trusted moral and sensory impressions. Corruption smelled corrupt. Purity smelled floral, or at least less offensive. The trouble was that smell was only part of the story. The deadlier part often traveled through water that could look ordinary enough in a cup. To soften the problem, people dressed it. They hung sachets, burned perfume, dabbed carbolic solutions, tucked lavender into drawers, and carried little scented devices near the face. A room with a chamber pot and a bowl of rose petals was still a room with a chamber pot, but the petals allowed everyone to imagine they were participating in civilization rather than surrendering to necessity. Imagine one bedroom now, curtains drawn against the cold, a coal scuttle beside the grate, boots drying badly by the hearth, a hairbrush on the dressing table, a Bible, a cracked china basin, a sleeping child in a trundle bed. Under the larger bed, half hidden by shadow, the plain white curve of the pot. It waits there like an uninvited truth everyone agrees not to discuss before breakfast. Morning comes, someone yaws, someone coughs, someone lights the fire, someone empties the pot, someone opens the window and regrets it, someone pours tea, and the house resumes its performance of respectability. There is tenderness in this performance as well as denial. People were not wrong to want beauty near their discomfort. They were trying, within the limits available to them, to arrange the unavoidable into something survivable. Keep that in mind as we leave the bedroom and follow the household's hidden remainder outward, because whatever the room cannot keep for long, the city receives. Whatever the pot cannot solve, the street inherits, and whatever the street cannot absorb, the river remembers. You sense the river before you see it. The air broadens and somehow darkens. Beneath smoke and stable smell comes a slower odor, one with weight in it, almost a texture. The Thames in the 19th century was not a romantic ribbon through the capital so much as a great receiving body, a patient black ledger on which the city wrote its habits in liquid form. Barges moved on it. Ferries crossed it. Dock labor depended on it. Parliament admired it when conditions allowed. And nearly everyone contributed to its suffering, whether they meant to or not. On certain evenings you might stand on a bridge and almost believe the river noble. Lamps would paint long wavering bars on the surface. The tide would move with grave confidence. Church domes and chimneys would dissolve softly into smoke. Then the wind would turn, and the illusion would collapse in one breath. This was a river carrying runoff from the streets, overflow from cesspits, effluent from industry, refuse from slaughterhouses, and the consequences of new plumbing systems, eager to flush without any coherent plan for where flushing should end. By the time the great stink announced itself to political power, the city had been rehearsing the disaster for years. Heat intensified the odor until it felt less like smell than invasion. Curtains at Westminster were treated with chemicals. Windows became enemies. Men who might have ignored the daily burdens of poorer districts suddenly discovered sanitation when the Thames reached their own nostrils. Reform has a way of arriving only after inconvenience climbs the social ladder. And still, one must be careful not to tell the story only as hypocrisy. There was also ignorance, scale, rapid urban growth, and a sincere but mistaken theory of disease. Miasma explained what the senses experienced. If foul districts bred sickness, then foul air must be the culprit. The logic had a terrible elegance. It produced all sorts of coping rituals. Vinegar-soaked cloths pressed to the face, posies carried by doctors and ladies, limes scattered in hopes of cleansing, windows opened for circulation, or shut against corruption depending on whom you asked. The city became a laboratory of anxious half-solutions. Somewhere within that confusion stood a physician prepared to look not just at the smell but at the map. John Snow's investigation of the Broad Street outbreak belongs to a different kind of drama, a quiet one. He traced deaths. He watched where people drew water. He noticed patterns where others noticed only odor. In a city convinced that sickness floated on the air, he followed it into the pump. There is something profoundly soothing in that method. While everyone around him interpreted the world through panic and atmosphere, he used patience. But those families who fetched from public pumps were not waiting for intellectual revolutions. They needed water for tea, for cooking, for washing, for children, for soup, for cloths on fevered foreheads. Sending a child with a pail to the pump was part of the rhythm of life. Queue, fill, lift, spill a little, walk home, begin again. If that source was contaminated, then danger entered not as drama, but as routine. The most devastating things often do. Stand now at the bridge rail and let the city stretch on either side of you. Downstream, barges move like low black thoughts. Upstream, factory chimneys contribute their share to the haze. On the embankment, a man pulls his collar up and walks briskly, pretending he cannot smell what everyone smells. A woman lifts a scented handkerchief to her nose with practiced discretion. A boy on an errand pauses only long enough to spit into the current, as if adding one more opinion to the whole immense conversation. The river sound at night is not loud. It whispers against stone. It sucks gently at moorings. It carries small floating knocks from wood against wood. If you listen without thinking too hard about what passes beneath the surface, it is almost calming. That is one of history's strangest gifts. Distance can turn even a civic failure into a lullaby for those not required to drink from it. You are not required. Remember that. You may stand here and let the cool of the rail anchor you. You may let the lamps reflect and break and mend themselves on the water. You may listen only to the softer parts. We are not here to be overwhelmed. We are here to notice how a city's private habits become public weather, and then to let that knowledge drift past like a barge sliding under the bridge. Below the level of the street, below the bridge stones, below the chatter of taverns and the clatter of wheels, there was another city altogether. It was made not of facades, but of channels, culverts, brick runs, open drains covered over in pieces, older ditches pressed into new service, and the half-built logic of a metropolis that had expanded faster than its hidden organs. Victorian sewers before major reform were not the smooth, invisible modern miracle we like to imagine. They were burdened compromises, go down only in thought. There is no reason to descend too far. A lantern glow catches wet brick. The air changes at once, thick and close and stale with long use. Water moves where you cannot quite see it. Something skitters. Somewhere a drip counts out time. Much of this underground world had never been intended for what it carried. Rainwater channels inherited household waste. Ancient roots took on industrial burdens. The whole system worked just enough to delay panic and failed just enough to breed catastrophe. Here labored those strange shadow workers whom polite society preferred not to picture. Sewer crews clearing blockages, men hauling night soil from cesspits, tashers scavenging the foulness for coins, metal, and anything that could be sold. Mudlarks on the river margins searching the slime for fragments of value left by a careless or crowded city. Poverty always studies the edges of waste more carefully than wealth does. Picture one man with a hooked pole and a lantern. He is not heroic in the statue sense. He is tired, damp, underfed, practical, and very much aware that any tiny object he fishes from the muck might mean supper. The darkness above him is crossed by the muffled thunder of wheels. He feels the city rather than sees it. Every cut on his hand is a risk. Every sudden surge is a warning. Every step is a negotiation with slime, brick, and luck. There were stories, of course, because men who work in dangerous places collect stories the way their boots collect filth. Lucky finds, cursed rings, sudden flood rushes, gas pockets that extinguished lamps, rats big enough to deserve names, places where the tunnel narrowed so sharply a body could not turn gracefully, places where a storm transformed trickle into torrent. The underworld breeds superstition because no one can afford to believe it is only engineering. And yet, out of this underworld came some of the clearest evidence that the city could not continue as it had. Overflow backed into cellars, drains regurgitated in basements, yards pooled with what yards should never pool with. Public health crises climbed from the invisible into the undeniable. The system was speaking in its own language of brick, smell, and return. Water collection above ground linked to all of this more intimately than many understood. Not everyone had water piped conveniently indoors. Women, servants, and children fetched and carried. Buckets scraped steps, pump handles rose and fell. A queue at dawn could shape the whole day's household rhythm. If the pump was crowded, breakfast waited. If the route was muddy, half the effort might slosh down a skirt and into the street. If the source was tainted, the taint arrived in tea, in soup, in rinse water, in baby bottles, in damp cloths laid on hot heads. That is why the eventual work of engineers like Joseph Bazalgette deserves its own quiet reverence. Grand history often prefers speeches and battles. I have always thought there is something nobler in the person who stares at a map of a city and asks with absolute seriousness where its sewage ought to go. Bazalgette's great intercepting sewers were not poems, yet they saved lives on the scale of poems and empires. Brick by brick, tunnel by tunnel, they gave London a chance to become less at war with its own hidden functions. Still, in the years before such systems matured, families lived within the old arrangement. They did not experience it as a lesson in urban planning. They experienced it as a damp patch in the cellar, a stench in the alley, a queue at the pump, a child with sudden cramps, a landlord slow to repair, a bucket too heavy, a drain too slow, a room too close, and a nagging feeling that the whole city was somehow breathing through its feet. Let us leave the tunnels now, rise again into the air of the street, smoky though it is. Strange how almost fresh it feels after the thought of the sewer. The lamps are still burning, the houses still hold their tight rows. A cart rolls by with sacks of coal. A watchman mutters to a driver, somewhere behind shuttered windows. Kettles are warming for the first wash of the morning. The city remains difficult, but you have space again around your mind. Hold on to that. We are turning now from the public machinery of hygiene to the intimate labor of the body. A full bath for many Victorians was not a habit but an operation. Hot water did not arrive obediently at the turn of a tap for most people. It had to be fetched, heated, carried, poured, and then used with a frugality modern bathrooms have almost erased from memory. Coal cost money, time cost strength, privacy cost space. Even the idea of immersing the whole body in one tub of warm water could feel extravagant, suspicious, or simply impossible depending on class and circumstance. More common was the partial wash, face, neck, hands, maybe the armpits, maybe the feet, if they had suffered enough to demand attention. A basin on a stand, a rag, a chip jug, a little harsh soap if there was enough. The rest of the body lived in negotiation with linen, powder, faith, and postponement. It is tempting to read this only as indifference, but often it was arithmetic. What fuel remains? Who needs warmth more? How cold is the room? Is there a child feverish upstairs? Is laundry already soaking? Can anyone spare the hour? And above the practical calculations floated those beliefs about health that made bathing morally and physically complicated. Many feared that hot water softened the body or opened the pores to illness. Sudden chills after washing seemed dangerous. Bodies were not yet understood in bacteriological terms, but in a haze of humors, airs, constitutions, and vulnerabilities that made perfect sense within the medical culture available. A person who bathed sparingly might think himself cautious rather than dirty. When bathing did happen at home, it often gathered the household around it like weather. A tub dragged into the warmest room, kettles hissing, children summoned, towels waiting near the grate, steam on the windows. Somebody complaining about the wait, somebody else insisting the water not be wasted. In smaller homes, the bath might occupy the kitchen because the kitchen had the fire. There is a certain comedy in the domestic choreography, and a certain exhaustion, too. Cleanliness required logistics. The water itself had a social life. One person in, one person out. Top it up, shift the soap, bring another kettle, hurry before the coals die down. The notion of every family member receiving an entirely fresh tub of hot water belonged more to fantasy than to weekly reality. Children often came later in the order. So did servants. By the time the last bather climbed in, the water might already tell a whole family story without speaking a word. Soap could help and punish at the same time. Some was serviceable. Some was rough enough to sting. Homemade batches varied. Commercial varieties offered promises of purity, brightness, and refinement. But they did not always feel gentle against skin already stressed by weather, labor, and infrequent soaking. To wash with strong soap in a cold room and dry with a towel like coarse canvas was not exactly a sensual ritual. And yet relief could still arrive. Relief in warmth, relief in steam, relief in the strange lightness that follows having even a portion of the city lifted from your skin. Public bathhouses expanded that relief into a civic possibility. They were not luxurious, but for working families they could be transformative. Warm water outside the home, available for a modest fee, meant access to a kind of comfort that household arrangements rarely allowed. Imagine the corridor lined with doors, steam moving in ghostly sheets overhead, children trying not to slip, women carrying bundles of clothes toward attached laundries, men emerging pink-faced and quiet, as if embarrassed by how much they had enjoyed being warm for 20 minutes. Bathhouses had their own smells, a layered blend of whetstone, soap, wool, coal heat, damp timber, and humanity on the mend. Attendants moved with the weary competence of people who had seen every kind of modesty and every kind of impatience. Water sloshed, buckets knocked. Somewhere a baby protested a rinse. Somewhere a mother laughed. Somewhere an old man sat longer than necessary, simply because the heat felt like mercy. For the poor, the bathhouse could be one of the few places where bodily care did not depend entirely on household fuel and space. For the respectable middle class, it could still feel slightly public, slightly common, slightly beneath aspiration, even while being undeniably useful. For the wealthy, there were better arrangements at home, though even there servants still performed the hidden labor of heating and carrying that modern plumbing later taught the upper classes to forget. Picture a single bath scene clearly. A tin tub stands near the fire. A girl waits with knees drawn up under a blanket until her turn comes. Her mother tests the water with red hands roughened by soap in winter. On a chair lie a clean shift, stockings darned at the heel, and a ribbon she hopes is still respectable enough for Sunday. Outside, the lane remains muddy and unforgiving. Inside, for one small pocket of time, there is steam, warmth, and the belief that a body can begin again. That belief matters. It is one of our first real returns to safety tonight. Even in an age of soot and sewer gas, there were moments when the body was cared for with great seriousness. Imperfectly, awkwardly, frugally, but with real seriousness. Hold that warmth a little longer. Let the fire click in the grate. Let the towel dry slowly by the chair. We will stay with the body, but move upward now to that part of it which Victorian culture groomed almost obsessively while washing it. Far less often than we might expect. Hair in the Victorian world was managed, disciplined, perfumed, braided, pinned, brushed, waxed, and admired long before it was regularly washed. Washing hair was an undertaking. Long hair took time to wet through. Time to soak, time to rinse, and even more time to dry in a damp climate without modern tools. A woman with thick hair might avoid the whole process for weeks, simply because it would consume half a day and leave her vulnerable to chill. A man could manage more easily, but even then, frequent washing was not assumed. So instead, people developed methods of respectable delay. Brushing redistributed oils and looked industrious. Powders absorbed some of the shine. Pomades added a deliberate sheen that could pass for elegance rather than accumulation. Macassar oil promised sleekness, and sleekness in a culture of moral surfaces had real social value. If hair lay obediently, perhaps the life beneath it did too. Those antimacassars draped over chairbacks and old photographs in antique parlors tell their own sly little story. They are the furniture's defensive answer to the human head. A world that prized glossy hair needed barriers between ambition and upholstery. What appears decorative is often a domestic artifact of collective scalp management. Children's hair involved another category of labor entirely. Mothers and older sisters combed, parted, braided, and inspected by window light. Lice cared nothing for class, crowded schools, shared bedding, second-hand caps, narrow rooms, and infrequent full washing all gave them opportunity. Nitpicking was not a metaphor, but a recurring evening occupation. A metal comb, a damp cloth, patience, and a child trying not to squirm too much under parental concentration. There is a tenderness in that concentration. Think of a mother at dusk, her own back aching from wash day, still taking time to part a child's hair carefully and work through the strands one section at a time. The child complains, dozes, asks a question, leans against her knee. Outside, the alley smells of coal and damp straw. Inside, the ritual is almost meditative. Comb, inspect, wipe, begin again. Love often looks like repetition. Women's hair, especially in the middle and upper classes, was arranged into styles that were partly fashion and partly infrastructure. Hair pinned up stayed cleaner than hair loose on the shoulders. Braids and coils contained volume, signaled propriety, and reduced daily chaos. Caps protected, ribbons redeemed. A head well arranged implied a life similarly arranged, which was one of the great visual fictions of the era. Men pursued their own performances, side parts precise as ruler lines. Mustaches waxed into confidence, beards brushed and oiled. Facial hair was not merely fashionable, it was ideological, associated at various points with vigor, seriousness, modern masculinity, even health. Yet a beard in a world of infrequent bathing and soup-based dinners gathered memory quickly. A gentleman's whiskers could carry an entire luncheon farther into the afternoon than anyone wished. Barbers therefore mattered. They were craftsmen of civility, trimming not only hair but the visible edges of social acceptability. A shave, a cut, a splash of tonic, a little gossip, perhaps a chair by the window where the day's dust moved in slanting light. For some men, the barber's was one of the few places where personal grooming became a small ceremony. For women who could afford hairdressers, the ritual could expand into an afternoon of pins, hot irons, scent, and endurance. Beauty has always had a relationship with time. In the Victorian era, it also had a relationship with smoke, damp weather, and chairs protected by cloths. Hats, bonnets, caps, scarves, and shawls completed the arrangement while complicating it. Head coverings guarded against weather, signaled respectability, and trapped warmth. They also trapped moisture. A bonnet on a wet day could create its own little weather system above the brow. Yet one wore it anyway. Society rarely grants practical exemptions when appearances are involved. Now, look through one window. A girl sits on a stool while an older woman braids her hair by lamplight. On the table lie a brush with missing bristles, a bottle of oil, 2 ribbons, and a comb that has known many heads. The girl's eyelids lower with sleepiness. The braid tightens. The ribbon is tied. It is such a small thing, and yet it glows with meaning. To groom a child for the next day is to assume there will be a next day. Sometimes that assumption was faith as much as habit. Let the braids settle over the girl's shoulder. Let the room soften around the scene. This is another return to safety. Another little chamber of care within the larger city. Hair may have been greasy, powdered, perfumed, infested, disciplined, and overworked. But it was also brushed by loving hands. That matters before we turn to the mouth, where Victorian life often left its deepest quiet aches. A city full of bread crusts, sugared tea, cheap treats, pipe smoke, damp air, and abrasive tooth powders was not likely to produce many serene mouths. The signs were everywhere once you noticed them. A man chewing carefully on one side, a woman lifting her hand to cover a laugh before it opened too far, a clerk speaking through stiff lips as though he preferred words not to require the teeth they once did, a child with a gap that arrived too soon. Dental pain moved through the century like weather inside the head. Toothbrushes existed, certainly. So did powders, rinses, scrapers, and home remedies. But access varied. Regular use varied. And effectiveness varied most of all. Brushes made with animal bristles wore out, retained smells, and were not always private possessions. A family might share. Powders made from chalk, salt, charcoal, soot, crushed shell, or brick promised a brighter mouth through force rather than gentleness. The principle seemed to be that enough friction must equal cleanliness. Enamel rarely agreed. Peppermint and clove could sweeten the impression. They could not rescue a tooth already turning inward toward trouble. And trouble came easily. Sugar consumption rose. Cheap confections tempted children. Bread and pudding stuck where they could. Little cracks became bigger ones. Gum irritation deepened. A dull pulse at the root of a tooth could ruin sleep more thoroughly than any sermon about temperance. People learned to live with low levels of pain. Astonishingly well. They softened food in tea or broth. They avoided one side of the mouth. They chewed slowly. They swallowed pride and chose softer meals when pride could be swallowed. But once pain crossed a certain threshold, the likely answer was extraction. Preservation dentistry existed in limited form. Extraction was more available, more direct, and often more brutal. Here the century becomes both grim and faintly theatrical. Traveling dentists at fairs, shopfront practitioners with signs promising painless relief, barbers and mechanics of the mouth, forceps laid out with confidence not always matched by training. A chair, a cloth, a hand on the shoulder, a warning to hold still. And then the sudden bright violence of pulling. For many, this was the most practical medicine modernity had to offer their suffering teeth. One almost has to soften the scene not by denying it, but by stepping back into its ordinariness. People lined up because pain had already reduced their world to a point. The scream or silence or tears mattered less than the chance of release afterward. And release, if it came, could feel miraculous even when followed by a mouth emptier than before. False teeth promised restoration to those who could afford them, though the promise was only partly fulfilled. Ivory, metal springs, plates, clamps, and in some notorious cases, human teeth sold through networks of poverty and war. The age was inventive, but invention does not always equal comfort. Dentures could click, pinch, shift, and advertise themselves at unfortunate moments. Still, A prosthetic smile was better than none in a society attentive to surfaces. Consider the social choreography created by bad teeth, smiling with lips closed, turning slightly while speaking, covering the mouth with a handkerchief at table, preferring soft cakes to crusty bread, offering to pour tea rather than join noisy conversation. Pain alters personality by tiny degrees, so does embarrassment. Many Victorian faces carried a reserve that may have been partly moral training and partly dental caution. Yet, there was also humor, resilience, and commerce. Lozenges sold on corners, clove oil kept in drawers, peppermint offered after meals, apothecaries advertising breath refreshers with cheerful optimism. A girl standing near the bakery with a tin of mints might represent not vanity, but hope that one could meet the world at least halfway. Warm bread smells drift from the baker's door as you pass. Inside, a man tears a roll very gently with front teeth he trusts more than the back. He glances up and gives you that look people share when discomfort has become part of daily identity. He manages. Everyone here manages. That is the refrain beneath every Victorian discomfort. They managed until relief arrived or did not. Let the bakery warmth do some of the soothing here. Feel the contrast between the chill street and the golden room beyond the glass. Hear the soft scrape of a loaf on the counter. Smell yeast and crust and a little coal smoke from the oven. Even in a century of dental misery, bread still came out warm in the morning, and someone still remembered to sweeten a child's breath with mint. We can carry that forward as we move from the mouth to the cloth that surrounded the body all day and kept so much of the city pressed close to the skin. Clothing in Victorian England was a second atmosphere. It absorbed smoke, rain, labor, perfume, skin oils, kitchen steam, horse-drawn dust, and whatever the street had flicked upward during the walk. Garments were expensive relative to income, laborious to wash, difficult to dry, and too precious to treat casually. The modern fantasy of fresh clothes as a daily baseline would have seemed fantastical in many homes. One wore what one had, aired what one could, mended what tore, and changed the most visible pieces first. Undergarments were not absent, but they were not abundant. Women had chemises and petticoats, sometimes drawers, often more layers than comfort would recommend. Men had shirts, drawers, socks, undershirts, but quantity mattered. If you owned only a few serviceable pieces, changing frequently was not a matter of virtue, but of inventory. What lay next to the skin often stayed there longer than anyone would prefer. Laundry, therefore, became one of the great hidden labors of the century. It consumed fuel, water, soap, time, space, muscle, and patience. Wash day could dominate a household, buckets hauled in, fires built up, sheets soaked, shirts scrubbed at collars and cuffs until knuckles smarted, towels wrung, stockings sorted, children warned to keep away from the copper. Steam clouded the windows. The whole house smelled of hot cloth, soap, damp wood, and fatigue. Lye soaps cleaned well enough to justify their cruelty. Hands reddened, cracked, and peeled. Washerwomen's fingers knew every roughness of fabric. A laundress at work was one of the most physically eloquent figures in the Victorian city, all strain and rhythm and endurance. Bend, scrub, rinse, wring, lift, hang, repeat. She fought not only dirt but time. Clean garments had to be ready before work resumed, before Sunday, before callers came, before shame entered through the door in the form of a disapproving eye. Some methods now seem almost comic in their pragmatism. Urine saved for whitening or stain removal, bluing agents for the illusion of brightness. beating garments outdoors to drive out dust, brushing rather than washing heavy coats, turning collars, reversing cuffs, unpicking and remaking children's clothes from adult garments. The household economy of cloth was imaginative because it had to be. Drying was its own trial. Outside, smoke and soot settled on linen. Rain threatened. Alley dust rose. Inside, clothes hung near the fire and absorbed the house itself, emerging less fresh than transformed from one smell into another. White shirts turned yellowish with repeated compromise. Wool retained everything. Corsets held the memory of summer. Aprons told whole days in grease and flour and contact. Detachable collars and cuffs became one clever answer to social judgment. If the visible edge was clean, much could be inferred about the unseen shirt beneath. Respectability often began at the neck. A man with a fresh collar might still be wearing yesterday and the day before underneath it. Society had decided where to look, and industry supplied removable surfaces for that gaze. Women's clothing made bodily comfort harder. Corsets trapped heat and sweat. Petticoats layered friction upon weight. Heavy skirts dragged close to roads not fit to touch cloth at all. A hem might collect half the street before supper. Gloves protected the hands from cold and grime, but also carried their own stale secrets inside the fingers. Hatbands absorbed, bonnets held weather. Shoes never dried properly in winter, and yet garments also carried pride. A well-patched sleeve, a carefully whitened apron, a Sunday dress kept wrapped in paper, a child's best collar ironed flat for church. To preserve clothing was to preserve status. Memory, possibility. A shawl might have belonged to a mother, and then to a daughter. A coat could descend through brothers until the elbows gave out. Fabric held family chronology as surely as photographs did. See now the narrow yard behind a row of houses. A line stretches from wall to wall. On it hang shirts, stockings, a child's shift, a towel, 2 aprons, a pair of drawers patched so often the patches seem original. A woman comes out with a basket and lifts each item with care, not because the cloth is fine, but because replacement would be hard. Her hands are red from soap, her shoulders are tired, and still she smooths a sleeve before folding it, as though acknowledging that effort itself deserves elegance. This, too, is a return to safety. The scene is domestic, repetitive, almost lullaby-like in its own way. Cloth on the line, wind moving through sleeves, the low thud of a basket against a hip. Somewhere a kettle starting again. The city may be dirty, but the act of washing remains a quiet refusal to let dirt have the final word. From the basket, we move naturally to the drawer, from the drawer to the sachet, and from the sachet to the Victorian art of smelling less like one's circumstances. Perfume in this world was not merely decoration. It was diplomacy between the body and society. It was a floral treaty proposed to reality every morning, and often broken by noon. Rosewater, lavender, violet, bergamot, verbena, sandalwood, orange blossom, rosemary, camphor, aromatic vinegars, sachets, pomanders, scented powders, glove perfumes, hair oils, handkerchief colonnades, all entered the daily struggle to put some chosen note between one's nose and everything else. A small scented box lifted to the face could make a church pew bearable. A lavender sachet in a linen press could persuade sheets to suggest summer rather than storage. A gentleman might scent his mustache wax or gloves. A lady might touch fragrance to her wrists, her bodice lining, her handkerchief, perhaps the corner of a letter. Fragrance offered not just allure but atmosphere. One could carry a private weather system in a pocket. The vinaigrette captures the age beautifully, elegant, practical, faintly desperate. A tiny container with a sponge soaked in aromatic vinegar, ready to be opened discreetly whenever the omnibus, theater, street, or drawing room became too much. Not exactly luxury, more like well-dressed self-defense. The nose had become one of the main battlefields of urban life, and the well-prepared went armed. Yet perfume could not conquer the city. It floated above it. Rose on top of smoke, citrus on top of damp wool, violet on top of unwashed layers, cabbage kitchens, horse traffic, and coal. Fragrance gave shape to aspiration, not absolute victory. Perhaps that is why it matters so much emotionally. People wanted one beautiful note close to them, one corner of sensation they could choose rather than inherit. Inside homes, scent mapped social aspirations. Parlors might carry polish. Dried flowers, upholstery dust, coal smoke, and a bowl of potpourri trying its best. Bedrooms held stale warmth, linen, skin, candle grease, and sometimes a sachet tucked into the pillow. Kitchens fought grease with boiling herbs, and still smelled of onion, broth, and iron. Nurseries added milk, cloth, and worry. Houses were archives of daily life, written in the language of air. Coal complicated everything. It warmed rooms, cooked meals, dried socks, heated irons, boiled bathwater, and filled lungs. Curtains trapped it, mirrors dulled with it, wallpaper grayed under it. Women, often closest to the fire through the longest hours, breathed the house most deeply of all. The celebrated Victorian hearth was both comfort and quiet assault. Look into one parlor now. A fire glows. A father has fallen asleep in a chair with his newspaper open. A mother is darning by the light of a lamp. The room smells of tea, ashes, wool, and a little lavender from a dish on the mantel. Soot has settled where no one can see it yet. The moment is still real comfort. Human beings are astonishing in their ability to build tenderness inside environments that would horrify later centuries. Hospitals, too, had their own air. Before antiseptic routines fully transformed them, wards might hold a mixture of scrubbed floors, stale linens, medicine, fear, and procedures performed with care. But not yet with the invisible discipline we now associate with cleanliness. One can picture rows of beds, high windows, earnest nurses, the scrape of a basin, the hiss of a lamp, the hope that order itself might heal. The desire to heal often outran the science of how. Perfume touched even mourning. Bodies laid out for viewing might be surrounded with frankincense or flowers. Parlors opened for condolence visits carried the scent of wax, black fabric, and attempts at dignity. The nose, again, had to be persuaded. Death was old. Smell was immediate. Rituals stepped in between. And yet, for all the floral effort, the strongest fragrance in Victorian England may have been effort itself. The effort to be acceptable, to be bearable, to be thought refined, to soften one's home, one's body, one's letters, one's gloves, one's bed linen, one's memory. A young couple passing under a lamp after an evening visit might smell of rose water, damp coats, and a little fear of being discovered out too late. That is not failure. That is life trying to perfume itself. Keep them in mind as self. They walk ahead of you, slow and careful on the slick stones. They lean a little closer, but not too close. Their sleeves nearly touch. The city around them is still dirty, still crowded, still undersmoked, overwatered, half-educated in medicine, and wholly determined to continue. But in the space between their two perfumed silences, there is something gentle enough to carry us onward. Now the street narrows, and from one upper room comes the sudden cry of a child. Not a dramatic cry, just the sharp, exhausted protest of a small body, unable to explain its discomfort in any other language. Victorian childhood makes the entire question of hygiene feel more tender and more heartbreaking at once. Adults could adapt to grime, pain, and smell through habit. Children had to inherit those conditions before they had words for them. Imagine the nursery, or in poorer homes, the corner of the room that served as one. A cradle or cot, perhaps a chair, a wash basin, folded cloths not as clean as one wishes, a jug of water gone cool, a cat asleep by the embers, a mother who has not slept enough in months, an older sibling shushed into stillness. The air is warm with breath and milk and damp linen and the slight sourness of reused cloth. The child's world begins here. Birth itself took place in rooms that modern medicine would read with alarm in families, then read as ordinary necessity. Linen boiled if possible. Tools not always as clean as anyone hoped. The laboring mother surrounded by women, by heat, by advice, by prayers, by old practices handed down because something had to be trusted. Infant mortality did not arrive as a statistic to these homes. It arrived as silence after effort, or fever after hope, or the strange, terrifying stillness of a child who had been crying only an hour before. That background gives every act of care a different light. Swaddling, however misguided in some forms, emerged from the desire to secure and protect. Cloth nappies were reused because cloth itself was work. Feeding bottles, when used, were often difficult to clean, not because mothers were careless, but because design and knowledge lagged behind need. Milk soured, residue clung, tiny stomachs suffered. A mother might do everything she knew and still lose the argument with bacteria she could not yet imagine. Bathing babies involved its own anxieties. Too cold, too hot, too sudden. Soap in the eyes. A slippery little body and hands already tired. Some believed cool water strengthened. Others feared chill. Nearly everyone feared illness, though not always by the correct route. The nursery remained a place where love and misunderstanding intertwined constantly. Listen, though, to what else fills the room, humming, the creak of the chair as the baby is rocked, the small paper crackle of a packet of powder, a whispered prayer, the soft tap of a spoon against a cup, the child's breathing after the crying eases. These sounds matter as much as the dangers. History can become cruel when it remembers only what went wrong, and not how tenderly people tried within what they knew. As children grew, they entered a wider ecology of grime, crawling across soot-dark floors, putting fingers in mouths after touching door frames, toys, pets, siblings, and shoes, wearing hand-me-down garments that carried stains and wear patterns from previous owners, sharing beds, sharing cups, sharing school benches, sharing combs, caps, coughs, and outbreaks of lice. Yet childhood insists on itself, even in those conditions. Children played. They laughed in alleys. They chased hoops through mud. They turned anything into a game, because that is what children do in every century. Schools could be crowded, noisy, underheated, over-disciplined, and alive with minor infestations. Teachers inspected hands and heads when they could. Sometimes a child might be praised for appearing neat, which in practice could mean that an exhausted mother had spent an extra half hour on mending, brushing, and wiping before dawn. Moral lessons accompanied hygiene lessons. Cleanliness was tied to obedience, industry, and self-control, a burden placed on families who often lacked the basic tools to achieve what reformers preached. Still, the image that remains with me is quieter. A small boy at the window with his nose to the glass, finger drawing a circle in condensation. Behind him, a cradle lined with worn fabric. On the floor, a toy with one wheel missing. By the fire, a cat curled into perfect contentment. The boy turns and waves at no one in particular. Perhaps at the street, perhaps at the night, perhaps at you. His face is sticky. His shirt is not fully buttoned. He is alive in that simple, bright way children are alive. The room behind him is neither ideal nor hopeless. It is simply trying. Let that trying become our deepest return to safety. The baby settles. The mother sinks into the chair. The cat sleeps. The school bell is still far away. For 1 minute the house is held together by warmth, fatigue, and love strong enough to continue even when it cannot fully protect. That is not a small thing. It prepares us for the last great reveal of Victorian hygiene, which is that cleanliness in this society was never only about water and soap. It was also about morality, control, and the stories people told about worth. Walk now into a slightly tidier district. The doorsteps are scrubbed, knockers gleam, curtains hang neatly. A woman passes with gloves spotless and chin lifted. A man in a good coat adjusts his cuffs as if refinement itself were a weatherproofing. Here, the city performs one of its most powerful illusions. The cleaner things look, the more one is tempted to believe that moral order has conquered material disorder. Victorian culture was full of that temptation. Cleanliness was linked to godliness, not always in the practical sense of washing hands and boiling water, but in the symbolic sense of discipline, restraint, self-command, and visible propriety. Soap advertisements sold character as eagerly as they sold lather. Manuals advised mothers on orderly homes as though order itself could hold back poverty. Charity visitors inspected rooms with eyes trained not only on need but on deservingness. A made bed, a swept floor, a brushed child might unlock sympathy. A dirty corner might invite judgment. This was cruel because it translated structural hardship into personal blame. If water was scarce, if soap cost too much, if a husband drank the wages, if a mother was ill, if 6 people shared one room, if the privy overflowed, if the landlord delayed repairs, then a dirty floor was not evidence of vice but of conditions. Yet, institutions often preferred morality to complexity. Moral narratives are easier to administer than material solutions. Schools taught children that slovenliness reflected weakness of character. Women carried a special burden as guardians of domestic respectability. They were expected to civilize the home, freshen the linens, guard the family's appearance, raise healthy children, and do so regardless of whether the household infrastructure made such goals realistic. A woman might inhale coal dust all day, scrub with raw hands, mend by poor light, and still be judged by the state of a cuff or the neatness of a shelf. Workhouses and other institutions intensified these ideas. New arrivals were washed, searched, sorted, and reclothed in procedures that mixed sanitation with control. Hair could be cut, personal garments removed, identity flattened into management. Cleanliness in that context did not always feel like care. It could feel like submission dressed as order. Hospitals, prisons, reformatories, schools, barracks, all developed architectural and procedural ideals linked to cleanliness because straight lines, pale walls, ventilation, inspection, and regulated bodies promised more than health. They promised governability. Dirt became a metaphor for everything institutions feared. Disorder, rebellion, looseness, danger, moral contamination. To clean was to classify was to control, yet everyday people often exceeded these moral scripts in humane ways. A mother boiled water not to prove virtue, but to soothe a child. A father mended boots because cold feet mattered more than sermons. A girl brushed her younger sister's hair because she loved her, not because a tract demanded neatness. Care is never fully captured by ideology. It leaks out in tender actions that cannot be reduced to social control. Think of the church now. A boy on the steps sells newspapers, fingers black with ink and city dirt. Inside, A lady kneels with gloves, pale and perfume carefully chosen. Who is cleaner? The question dissolves if one asks it gently enough. Bodies are one thing, souls another, systems a third. Victorian England often tangled them together until judgment became easier than understanding. Urban renewal projects later swept away neighborhoods in the name of sanitation, sometimes helping, often displacing. Reform movements could improve drains while ignoring where the displaced poor were expected to go next. Old districts were labeled festering, degraded, and then erased from the respectable map. Cleanliness, once moralized, becomes very useful to power. It can justify almost anything if spoken in a tone of concern. Still, I do not want to leave you only with critique. There is something more tender beneath it, even within a culture obsessed with visible order. Ordinary people kept turning cleanliness back toward care. They washed because warmth comforted. They aired sheets because sleep mattered. They swept because children crawled on the floor. They brushed collars because dignity felt like a form of resistance. These motives deserve the last word more than the sermons do. So we return once more to the river, because rivers are where cities confess. The bridge is quieter now, much quieter. The carts have thinned, footsteps arrive singly rather than in clusters. The lamps hum in their glass. Smoke has risen higher and spread thinner. The Thames below is dark, almost velvety in places, then broken by a line of light where the current folds around some hidden obstruction. A barge moves without hurry. Somewhere downstream, a chain clinks. The whole city seems to be exhaling itself into the night. Stand here with me and let everything you have seen loosen at the edges. The slick stones underfoot, the chamber pot under the bed, shared privy leaning in a yard, the reeking river, the damp brick of the sewer, the bathhouse steam, the mother's hands at the washtub, the comb through a child's hair, the careful bite of bread by aching teeth, the linen line in the yard, the sachet in the drawer, the cradle by the fire, the polished glove above an unwashed world. Let all of it blur gently together until it becomes less a list of horrors than a human landscape full of effort. This is what stays with me most strongly. Not that the Victorians were filthy in ways that flatter us by comparison, though many conditions were indeed dreadful. What stays is how people kept building routines of care inside those conditions. They warmed towels. They aired sheets. They perfumed handkerchiefs. They braided hair. They queued for water. They mended collars. They sang to babies. They sat by bathhouse steam. They walked to work in boots that had known too much and still polished them for Sunday. They wanted comfort, dignity, privacy, health, and beauty, and they reached for all of them with the imperfect means available. A city that called itself clean while hiding so much filth is not only a Victorian story. Every age has its polished surfaces and buried systems. Every age decides where to look and where not to look. Every age invents a perfume for what it would rather not name. But that thought does not need to keep you awake. It can drift past like river mist, noticed and then released. You have stayed with the city long enough now that even its uglier truths have softened into shape and shadow. The river no longer seems to stink so much as breathe. The lamps no longer merely illuminate. They keep watch. Behind windows, wicks are lowered one by one in a narrow house somewhere. A mother checks a child once more and finally sits down. In another, someone loosens a collar. In another, a servant empties the last basin and climbs the stairs in the dark by memory alone. In another, a girl unpins her hair and feels the clean coolness of her scalp for a single honest moment. In another, a man with a sore jaw leans into sleep because at night pain sometimes thins. The bridge rail is cool beneath your hand. The air is easier here, not pure, perhaps, but easier below. Water continues its old work of carrying away and carrying back. Above, the city settles under its blanket of smoke. You do not have to solve any of it tonight. You do not have to decide whether progress was triumph or farce, whether moral cleanliness helped or harmed more, whether the Victorians were brave or blind or both. You only have to stand here until standing becomes too much effort, and listening becomes almost the same thing as dreaming. Soon the sounds will simplify. A last distant hoofbeat, a final door closed softly, the low hush of the tide against stone, the faint metallic hum inside the lamp glass, your own breathing. Slow enough now to belong with the river. The city will go on without your attention. It always did. And when you leave it. If you leave it before sleep fully takes you, perhaps you will carry only a few small images rather than the whole burden of the century. A braid tied with ribbon, steam on a bathhouse window, red warmth in a cold street, laundry breathing on a line, a handkerchief scented with lavender, a child's palm on glass, a bridge over dark water. These are enough. Let the rest sink. Let the judgment sink. Let the smoke rise and disappear into the night above the rooftops. Let the river keep its own counsel. Let the lamps become softer and farther apart until they resemble low stars caught in the fog. Let the houses close their eyes, one window at a time. Let the city that once called itself civilized become only a murmuring shape in the dark, no longer asking to be examined, only listened to from a distance. And if somewhere beneath that distance there remains the quiet truth of human effort, of people trying to make harsh rooms gentler with soap, heat, cloth, and love, then let that truth stay with you a little longer than the smell, a little longer than the mud, a little longer than the century itself. The river moves, the lamps dim, the bridge holds. You do not have to do anything now. Only listen, only drift, only let the night carry the city away.